Hold one fact steady before examining anything else. The event itself does not contain the disturbance you feel about it. Something happens. A message arrives late. A colleague speaks briefly and walks away. A plan changes without warning. In each case, the event appears ordinary when described plainly. Nothing in the raw occurrence carries insult, rejection, or injustice by necessity. The event simply occurs. Yet the mind rarely leaves the event in that neutral form. Almost immediately, something additional appears. The delay becomes disrespect. The brief reply becomes dismissal. The change becomes unfair treatment. What was originally a small occurrence becomes a story that explains what it means about you, about others, about the situation itself. This addition often happens so quickly that it goes unnoticed. The mind does not say, "I am now interpreting this." It simply presents the interpretation as if it were part of the event from the beginning. But the Stoic position, articulated clearly by Epictetus, draws a strict boundary here. Events arrive as impressions. Meaning is supplied afterward through judgment. Disturbance begins only when the mind agrees with the interpretation it has added. If the interpretation changes, the disturbance changes. If the interpretation is withdrawn, the disturbance disappears even though the event remains exactly the same. Responsibility therefore cannot be placed on the event itself. The event only arrives. The story that follows is something the mind constructs. Notice this carefully. The meaning you quietly attach to events. Everything that follows depends on recognizing a small addition the mind makes to every event it encounters. An event occurs. Someone speaks briefly to you in a meeting. A message receives no reply for several hours. A plan you expected to succeed fails without warning. If these moments are described strictly in terms of observable facts, they remain limited and simple. A sentence was spoken. A reply did not arrive yet. An outcome turned out differently than expected. But the mind rarely leaves events in this stripped form. Instead, interpretation begins almost immediately. The brief reply becomes indifference. The silence becomes disrespect. The failed plan becomes evidence that something has gone wrong with you or with the situation. The original event is no longer the center of attention. What occupies the mind is the explanation attached to it. This explanation is the story layer. The event itself does not declare its meaning. Meaning is assigned. Yet once the interpretation appears, it is often treated as if it were part of the event from the beginning. The mind does not distinguish between what occurred and what it has concluded. Epictetus insists on separating these two elements. The impression arrives first. The mind registers what happened. This part is automatic. It belongs to the structure of perception. But immediately afterward comes something additional, the judgment that explains what the impression means. That judgment is not automatic in the same sense. It is the point where the mind begins to participate. Consider a familiar situation. A colleague walks past without greeting you. The raw event is minimal, a person walked by without speaking. Within seconds, however, a different layer may appear. Perhaps they are annoyed. Perhaps something you said earlier caused offense. Perhaps they are deliberately ignoring you. None of these conclusions are present in the event itself. They are supplied afterward. Another example appears in everyday delays. You send an important message and receive no reply for several hours. The event is simply the absence of response so far. Yet the mind often fills the silence with interpretation. Something must be wrong. The request must have been poorly received. The delay must signal disapproval or rejection. Again, the event remains unchanged, no reply yet. But the story layer grows around it. What makes this process difficult to notice is speed. The interpretation appears so quickly that the mind experiences it as part of the original event. There is no visible separation between perception and explanation. As a result, Reaction begins not to the event but to the meaning attached to it. Frustration grows around an imagined insult. Anxiety grows around an imagined outcome. Resentment grows around an imagined intention. The disturbance feels justified because the story now feels real. But from the Stoic perspective, the disturbance does not come from the event. It comes from agreement with the interpretation. If the story changes, the disturbance changes. If the story disappears, the disturbance loses its support. This is why Epictetus places such emphasis on the moment between impression and assent. The impression may arrive automatically, but the explanation that follows is not inevitable. It is something the mind proposes. And what the mind proposes can be examined. When the explanation is accepted immediately, the story layer becomes invisible. The interpretation merges with the event, and the reaction feels unavoidable. But when the explanation is paused and inspected, a different possibility appears. The event remains simple. The story begins to loosen. At that point, something important becomes visible. Disturbance does not begin with what happened. It begins with what the mind quietly added. This distinction is easy to understand when stated. It is much harder to see in real time. And understanding the mechanism does not yet mean the mind will apply it when impressions arrive quickly. That difficulty leads directly to the next question. Recognizing the mechanism is one thing. Training the pause before agreement is another. At the center of every disturbance there is a moment that usually passes unnoticed. Something happens and the mind immediately receives an impression. A sharp tone in a conversation. A message that seems abrupt. A result that turns out differently than expected. The impression arrives automatically. This first stage requires no decision. The senses report what appears to be happening. But the impression is not yet the problem. The next movement of the mind is where the situation changes. The mind does not simply observe the impression, it begins to interpret it. The tone becomes disrespectful. The message becomes dismissive. The unexpected result becomes failure. This shift from observation to interpretation is subtle, but it marks a decisive boundary. The Stoics described it precisely. Impression appears first, judgment follows, and then comes assent. Assent is the moment when the mind agrees with the judgment it has produced. Until that agreement occurs, the interpretation remains only a proposal. The mind suggests a meaning, but it has not yet committed to it. Once assent occurs, however, the interpretation becomes accepted as reality. The story that was added to the event now feels inseparable from it. This is where disturbance begins. The event itself does not force the reaction. The impression alone does not create anger, anxiety, or resentment. These states appear after the mind silently agrees with the explanation it has formed. Epictetus repeatedly returned to this point because it defines where freedom actually exists. The event is outside your authority. The impression that arrives through perception is also largely automatic. But assent, the agreement that turns interpretation into belief, belongs to the rational faculty. And because it belongs to the rational faculty, it can be examined. Most of the time this examination never occurs. The mind moves from impression to agreement almost instantly. The interpretation feels obvious, so the pause disappears. Reaction follows without scrutiny. Consider a simple exchange. Someone interrupts you while you are speaking. The impression arrives immediately, the interruption occurred. Within moments a judgment may appear, this person is being disrespectful. If assent follows without pause, irritation begins to form. Yet the interruption itself does not contain disrespect as a necessary fact. It may have occurred because the other person misunderstood the pause in your sentence. It may have happened because they believed the conversation required clarification. It may have been simple impatience. None of these explanations are visible in the original impression. What transforms the situation into an insult is the mind's agreement with a particular interpretation. Another example appears in ordinary delays. A report you submitted receives no response for several days. The impression is straightforward, there has been no reply yet. But interpretation often enters quickly. Perhaps the work was poorly received. Perhaps criticism is coming. Perhaps the silence indicates disappointment. The moment the mind agrees with that interpretation, tension begins to grow. The imagined meaning now governs the reaction, even though the event itself has not changed. This is why Epictetus insisted that impressions must be examined before they are accepted. The first appearance of meaning is not always reliable. The mind often attaches conclusions that feel convincing but remain untested. The Stoic discipline therefore focuses on a single skill, recognizing the brief interval before assent. In that interval, the interpretation is still optional. The mind can ask a simple question: is this explanation necessarily true, or is it only one possibility among many? This question does not deny the impression. It simply delays agreement long enough to observe what has been added. When the pause appears, the story layer becomes visible. What previously seemed obvious begins to reveal itself as interpretation. Without this pause, the process remains invisible. Impression blends into judgment, judgment blends into assent, and reaction appears inevitable. But when the interval is recognized, even briefly, the mechanism becomes clear. The event remains where it always was. The interpretation stands beside it, no longer hidden. Recognizing that separation is not yet discipline. It is only the beginning of it. Force is usually the first method people imagine when they hear the word discipline. They assume the mind must be restrained, suppressed, or pushed into silence whenever an interpretation appears. This assumption misunderstands the problem. Interpretation cannot be prevented. The mind produces explanations constantly. Impressions arrive and the intellect begins organizing them. That activity is natural to the rational faculty. Trying to eliminate interpretation entirely would be like trying to prevent the eyes from seeing. The Stoic task is different. The task is to train the moment before agreement. Epictetus described philosophy not as theory but as ascesis, practice directed at the faculty of judgment. The aim is not to silence impressions. The aim is to become precise about when the mind chooses to accept them. Training begins long before pressure appears. Most people try to correct judgment only after the reaction has already formed. Anger has begun. Anxiety has already expanded. At that stage the interpretation has already received assent, and the mind is attempting to reverse a commitment it has already made. The Stoic approach prepares earlier. The first form of training is anticipation of impressions. Each day will contain interruptions, delays, criticism, and unexpected changes. None of these are unusual events. They are ordinary features of shared human activity. Expecting their appearance does not create pessimism, it simply removes surprise when they occur. When the mind has already accepted that inconvenience will appear, the impression loses some of its urgency. The event arrives, but it does not feel like a violation of how the day was supposed to unfold. The second practice is the deliberate pause before assent. This pause does not require elaborate reflection. It can be extremely brief. One breath is often sufficient. The purpose of the pause is not to produce a perfect explanation but to interrupt the automatic agreement between impression and interpretation. When the mind pauses, even briefly, the story layer becomes visible. The interpretation that seemed inseparable from the event now appears as a possible explanation rather than a confirmed fact. Consider a simple situation. Someone responds sharply during a conversation. The impression arrives, the tone was abrupt. Without training, the mind quickly adds meaning, disrespect, hostility, dismissal, and accepts it. Reaction follows immediately. With training, the pause interrupts this sequence. The mind notices the interpretation forming and delays agreement. The tone may still have been abrupt, but the explanation behind it remains uncertain. Irritation loses its foundation because the verdict has not yet been confirmed. A similar pause can appear during delays or unexpected outcomes. A plan fails to produce the expected result. The first interpretation may declare the effort wasted or the situation unfair. When the pause appears, the interpretation remains visible as interpretation. The event remains simply an outcome. The third practice occurs at the end of the day. Stoic writers often recommended a brief evening review of one's judgments. This review is not a moral trial and not a source of guilt. Guilt itself is frequently another unexamined judgment, adding unnecessary accusation after the event has already passed. The purpose of the review is technical rather than emotional. The mind looks back at moments where assent occurred quickly and asks a simple question: where did the interpretation appear, and when did agreement follow? This observation gradually strengthens awareness of the mechanism. Over time, the pause becomes easier to recognize. The mind begins to see the formation of the story layer earlier in the process. Interpretations still appear, but they are less likely to pass directly into agreement without examination. Discipline, therefore, does not mean controlling every thought. It means recognizing where the decision actually occurs. And that decision always happens at the same point, the moment when the mind considers whether the explanation it has added should be accepted as true. When this training becomes consistent, interpretation no longer moves unnoticed. The story layer still appears, but it no longer governs reaction automatically. Freedom is often misunderstood because people look for it in outcomes. They assume freedom appears when circumstances improve, when conflict disappears, or when other people behave more predictably. In that model, stability in the external world becomes the condition for internal calm. The Stoic view reverses that assumption. Freedom does not appear when events become easier. It appears when interpretation stops governing reaction automatically. The event still occurs, the impression still arrives, and the mind may still produce its first explanation. What changes is the authority given to that explanation. The story layer loses its command. This does not mean the mind becomes silent. Interpretations will continue to appear because the intellect naturally tries to organize what it perceives. A delayed message may still generate the first thought that something is wrong. A sharp tone may still register as potentially hostile. These impressions do not disappear through discipline. What changes is what happens next. When the mind has been trained to pause before agreement, interpretation becomes visible as a proposal rather than a verdict. The explanation stands beside the event instead of replacing it. Because of this separation, reaction no longer feels inevitable. Consider again a common situation: someone offers criticism during a meeting. The words may sound abrupt, and the first impression may suggest disrespect. Without discipline, that interpretation is accepted immediately. Irritation follows, and the conversation begins to revolve around defending status or reputation. But when the mind has practiced the pause, the interpretation does not immediately receive assent. The criticism remains what it actually is, a statement spoken by another person. The meaning attached to it remains uncertain. Because the verdict has not been accepted, reaction remains under examination. A similar shift occurs when plans fail or outcomes change unexpectedly. The mind may still produce the familiar interpretation that something unfair has occurred or that effort has been wasted. Yet when the pause interrupts the process, the explanation loses its authority. The event remains an outcome. The story remains a possibility. From this point forward, the mind regains its role as examiner rather than narrator. Instead of reacting to the explanation it produced, it can ask whether the explanation deserves agreement. Sometimes the interpretation will prove correct. A criticism may genuinely contain hostility. A decision may indeed be unfair. Stoic discipline does not require denying these possibilities. What it requires is refusing to accept them without scrutiny. This distinction changes the structure of reaction. Instead of reacting automatically to the first interpretation that appears, the mind reacts only after examination has occurred. The reaction becomes deliberate rather than reflexive. That shift is the beginning of inner authority. Nothing about the external world has changed. People still speak abruptly. Messages still arrive late. Plans still fail. But the reaction is no longer governed by the first story the mind creates. This is why Stoic writers describe freedom as internal sovereignty. It does not depend on controlling events, and it does not require removing difficulty from life. It appears when the mind recognizes where its own agreement occurs. Once that point is recognized, authority returns to the place where it always belonged, the judgment that decides whether the interpretation should be accepted. Life does not become easier through this practice. Situations remain uncertain, and other people remain unpredictable. What changes is the relationship between impression and reaction. The story layer may still appear, but it no longer commands the response. Nothing further needs to be added before stating the final responsibility. Events will continue to arrive. Impressions will continue to appear. Interpretations will continue to form almost immediately afterward. None of these movements can be completely prevented, because they belong to the normal operation of the mind. What remains entirely yours is the agreement that follows. The story layer described earlier does not gain power simply by appearing. It gains power when the mind treats its explanation as established fact. Once that agreement occurs, reaction follows as if the interpretation had always been true. This is why Epictetus repeatedly returned to a single boundary: some things belong to you, and some things do not. Events do not belong to you. Other people's behavior does not belong to you. Outcomes, recognition, delay, criticism, and praise all occur outside your authority. They appear as impressions, and the mind receives them as it receives any other external occurrence. But the judgment that interprets those impressions belongs to you. The agreement that converts interpretation into belief belongs to you. No one else can perform that act of assent on your behalf. Another person may speak harshly. Another person may ignore a message. Another person may misunderstand your intention. These events can present impressions that feel strong and immediate. Yet none of them can force the mind to accept the interpretation it first proposes. The acceptance always occurs inside the faculty of judgment. Because of this, responsibility cannot be transferred outward. It cannot be placed on the event, on the other person, or on the situation. Those elements provide the impression, but they do not create the judgment that explains it. The mind performs that step itself. This realization often feels uncomfortable at first because it removes familiar explanations for disturbance. If the interpretation belongs to the mind, then the reaction cannot be blamed entirely on the event that preceded it. But this same realization reveals the only place where freedom actually exists. If disturbance came directly from events, it would remain beyond correction. Events cannot be controlled reliably, and other people cannot be directed according to personal preference. Life would remain unstable because the source of disturbance would always lie outside the mind's authority. The Stoic position rejects that conclusion. Disturbance appears when the mind agrees with the explanation it has added to the event. If the mind learns to examine that explanation before accepting it, the mechanism of disturbance becomes visible and correctable. This does not eliminate error. The mind will still assent too quickly at times. Interpretations will still be accepted without examination. Discipline does not create perfection. What it creates is awareness of where the decision occurs. When that awareness becomes stable, the story layer loses its invisibility. The interpretation still appears, but the mind recognizes it as something that requires approval before it governs reaction. And that approval belongs to the one faculty that remains entirely within your authority: judgment. Nothing outside you needs to change for this to begin. The mechanism already operates every time an impression appears. The only question is whether the interpretation will be accepted automatically or examined before agreement. Return to the pause. Nothing here requires exaggeration. Events will continue to appear in the same way they always have. People will speak abruptly. Messages will arrive late. Plans will succeed or fail according to conditions that often remain outside your control. None of this changes through philosophy. What changes is the place where interpretation is accepted. Epictetus insisted that disturbance does not come from the event but from the judgment attached to it. The mind receives an impression, produces an explanation, and then quietly agrees with that explanation. Once the agreement occurs, the reaction feels justified and unavoidable. But the agreement is yours. This is the responsibility that cannot be transferred to circumstances or to other people. The interpretation may appear quickly, but the assent that confirms it belongs to the faculty of judgment. When the pause becomes visible, the story layer loses its invisibility. The event remains what it is, and the interpretation stands beside it rather than replacing it. The work is simple in structure, though not easy in practice. Notice the impression, examine the judgment, and delay agreement long enough to see what the mind has added. Return to what is yours.